Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Faisal, and I'm an architect with Haptic in Washington, D.C., and I'm chapter chair for RIBA-USA's DC and Southeast regions. It's my great pleasure today to introduce to you Jason Bruges, who's the founder of Jason Bruges Studio in London. Is a collective of architects, artists, designers, technologists, coders and makers who create remarkable site-specific installations that translate environments into vibrant, kinetic, multisensory experiences. Um, for those of you who are joining us, thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to put them to Jason. Jason's joined today by his colleague Hazel, and I'd like to thank them both for making the time to do this. For the benefit of those of you, for those out there who may not know your work, Jason, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit, tell us a little bit about your studio, and take us through some key projects.
Yes. Well, good good evening or good lunch, good midday even.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a bit of a flicker going on there. Don't know if you can see that, but that's interesting.
No, you're right.
Um, so yeah, it's great to see everyone. And yeah, I'm based in London, and our art studio is in East London. And yeah, what I'd like to do is just introduce the studio and how we work, and talk. Yeah, I'll sort of slowly introduce you to the projects. So, been established for 22 years. I trained as an architect, so very much working within the built environment on commissions. And I'm going to sort of show you a few things that will illustrate that and kind of show you an introduction. So all sorts of scales, commissions that are commissioned for the cultural sector for as artworks. So this is a piece called Mirror Mirror at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Also design commissions. This is a project for Aston Martin. I'm going to give you a kind of fly through the studio. So this is the kind of studio, so you can sort of see that. Hopefully that video is playing smoothly.
Mm-hmm. It's great.
So we've got a very multidisciplinary team of nearly 30 people in the studio in London, and a mixture of creatives, technologists, full-time team that kind of help bring this work to life. And I popped into the presentation a kind of map, which sort of explains where we're working. And you'll sort of see we're working sort of globally, a lot in North America, but also in Middle East, across Europe, and into the kind of Far East as well. So the work is site specific. It responds to where it is. So it does involve traveling and finding out about all sorts of extraordinary cultures. And I'm going to show you this is sort of kind of a timeline in terms of some of the sort of key pieces of work. So we've got work here. So the studio very much started off. I'd worked for several years for Foster and Partners in Hong Kong and London, on kind of built on projects there. Also, then worked for a company called Imagination, who were creating interventions, installations, environments. And then I started to get commissions for public art projects for the built environment. So back in about 2001, 2002, were the first commissions as public artworks. And you can sort of see throughout the years, the sort of things at different scales, infrastructure projects like kind of stations and airports, right through to projects now in hospitals, universities, office buildings, right through to kind of openings for Olympic Games. So sort of many kind of different types of work. I'm going to talk you through some of the kind of key pieces of work. So let me show you a piece of work in Toronto. So this is quite evocative of some of our work in the public realm. So this was a commission from Tridel, a condominium developer in Toronto. And the view from the top of the CN Tower, something that gave me the kind of inspiration for this piece. So it was very much about shadows that were cast on the city and that would bring it to life. And you can sort of see this is the process we lead in the studio in terms of prototyping work. So you can cast a shadow onto the artwork and it kind of records it and brings it to life. So we develop these materials within our artworks. So looking up close, you can sort of see the materials, but also working with the kind of a construction palette. So, you know, this artwork is also built from the local granite that exists in that environment. And I'll quickly play a movie of that artwork in place. So I was just apologies there. I was just actually playing with my camera because there was a funny flickering, which I seem to have resolved.
Yeah, you're good now.
So yeah, this is sort of, yeah, in terms of sort of public realm project is an example of a permanent piece of work that that is kind of responding to the environment about it. And what I really, coming from kind of London, UK, it was kind of really interesting to sort of see how a city casts shadows and then kind of using those shadows as part of the artwork. So sort of very much part of the piece. So very kind of site specific piece. And then perhaps showing something a little bit more different, right down to a sort of piece of work in a lobby potentially. So this piece called Variegation Index was commissioned by British Land for one of their campuses in London. And this piece of work, it's an existing building, and they were basically looking at how it could be activated. So they were going to put a garden inside the lobby. And we started looking at how the installation could interact with that garden in the space. So the idea really was to create a way of looking at the plants to see how they're growing in real time. So we built these cameras based on the cameras that farmers use to analyze how well the plants are growing in real time. So the kind of photosynthesis is being analyzed and used as a set of instructions for how this artwork animates and kind of comes to life. So yeah, artworks that talk to the plants or talk to the kind of environment within the building. sort of an example of an interior work. And projects like this, we work in different sorts of ways. So sometimes the team, myself and I are commissioned directly to work on projects like this, or we answer projects that are competitions. Let me find an example of a piece of work that there was a result of a competition. Let me find something. Yeah, this project, this is in Denver. So this is Northwest Denver. It's the Colorado State University. It's a bridge that links two of their new buildings. And this artwork is talking to or are about the controlled horticultural departments in the university. They're doing all these kind of amazing experiments, looking at how plants grow. And this was advertised on the kind of arts portals for Percent for Art. So we expressed an interest and won the project. In fact, right at the start of the pandemic, it was my first kind of Teams interview to kind of promote an idea of an artwork that would take data from all the experiments happening within the university, within the controlled horticultural experiments, the controlled, the kind of labs, the growth chambers, the vertical farms, use that data to drive the media artwork on the bridge. So you can sort of see this work as it's coming to life on that bridge. And it was very much talking about, I was inspired, I'd sort of flown into Denver, looking at the kind of wonderful, well, mixed feelings about these fields. They're kind of amazing sort of toroidal circular patterns on the kind of ground that kind of fill and empty with the sort of pivot irrigation. As we know, the pivot irrigation is perhaps not perfect for the environment, but it's very kind of interesting, and it obviously really transforms the landscape. And that's why we got to these kind of circular motifs within the media artwork that kind of bringing it to life. And you can sort of see the journey from these experiments within the department, and we're kind of, again, we're looking like really getting into how the plants are growing, filming them in real time, and taking that data and using it to drive the media artwork that kind of crosses the bridge there. So that's sort of very much kind of approaching something really, I suppose, from a call for opportunity and working with a competition. So kind of quite exciting. Obviously, coming into a project where there's a sort of agreed scope, an agreed budget, and agreed timeline and everything. So it's kind of responding to that. But we're also working on projects where we come in at the very beginning of a project and collaborate quite often with architects. So I'll touch on a competition we've been working on recently. Well, for 8 years, we've been working on this project with Zaha, the architects, and it was really, again, an example. This is the competition entry, and it's been running, which was won and has been running ever since. And we pitched an idea for a station that was part tunnel, part enclosure, part media artwork. So you can't really take one away from the other. You need the media artwork to sort of create this sky, this media artwork that envelops the entire station and gives it its quality, gives it the kind of what it looks like. And I suppose this is an example of where we collaborate as a sort of an artistic studio, and myself as an artist and the team as artists, how we collaborate on perhaps an entire project. And we're sort of doing quite a few projects like this where we're working on master plans, entire buildings, and looking at kind of how they kind of come to life. So, you know, that kind of gives you a flavor of, you know, projects in existing buildings where they're being refurbished, right through to ongoing competitions, and also answering competitions for artworks on buildings. So we're working in lots of different ways. And as I say, most of the work is kind of permanent and is built to last as long as the building. And I can talk later about how we maintain these things, how we make sure they're going to have longevity. But equally, you know, we're also working on projects. In fact, why don't I talk about something that's temporary as a sort of counterpoint to this? And we were commissioned as a result of a competition to work on this project. But I'll show you the competition animation actually. So this was a sketch we did and presented to the Tokyo Arts Council for an idea for a robotic Zen garden that would celebrate the highlights of the Olympics themselves held in Tokyo. And I think if we'd realized what the odds were going to be, i.e. 10 to 2,500, we would probably may not have gone for it. But there was something that struck a chord with the sort of quite big sort of artistic jury that was looking at the kind of global interest in this project. So it was for a series of commissions that would create a sort of festival, artistic festival backdrop to the Olympics and Paralympics in 2020, obviously 2021. And we did create this garden, which was crafted and animated and transformed by robotic gardeners in response to information we basically scavenged from broadcast feeds. So I'll show you a little video which explains this. Probably one of the harder projects I've delivered in my life. It was sort of mid-pandemic, state of emergency, and in Tokyo there was a bubble around, essentially a sort of bubble around the Olympics, so we couldn't get involved directly with the Olympics. And my team and I and a few others, I think we traveled on essentially diplomatic visas because there was no travel into Japan at that time. So yeah, so that's sort of, I think, interesting point probably to jump off into. I hope we've set this up. There's a lot more about questions, I think, and having a conversation. Got lots more projects to show, but we're sort of wondering whether we can have a bit of a conversation and also obviously answer questions, and I can show more work through that process.
Yeah, I think that's great, and so I would encourage everyone who's tuning in to ask questions in the Q&A, and I will certainly pose them to you. I want the Constant Gardeners, I think, is a remarkable project, and I want to ask you a little bit about that. But going back to the first couple that you introduced, there's a thread in there that I had not appreciated, in which the very precise tools of machines and coding and devices are brought to bear on processes that are natural, organic, unpredictable, much more glitchy and messy and uncertain. And you know, the Toronto piece, I think, was a really interesting one in which you've got something that's in some ways quite predictable in terms of its function, but then as people start to interact with it, it has this sort of playful, chaotic sort of character in which it's almost glitching, and sort of the edge at the edges, and that gives it a kind of a life of its own. And I wonder if in the project how you think about that distinction between the sort of machine and unpredictable the nature, because nature obviously plays a big part in feeding into what the devices are doing.
Yeah, I mean that's very good, because it is, what can you do with technology that does give your work the essence of having that kind of living quality and sort of coming to life, and the things that don't quite work, or the way that people subvert what you do as well in terms of interacting with things. And in fact, I'll show you another one from the family of the kind of shadow wall pieces of work, which, and for me, you know, the piece in Toronto was very much about that kind of sun path, very much about architecture that you know, does respond to its very precise environment. And but I can show this version of that piece of work, and this sits in a underpass in London, in Wembley Park, and the piece there uses the sort of same expression and the same sort of technology. It's scavenging kind of shadows and using to sort of play back and create content within the artwork. But again, if you look at the video here, you can sort of see that people very much use this kind of developing piece as something that's very playful. It's used for performances. It's used for people to film in a place that would otherwise be kind of underused and underutilized. So this is a sort of public commission by a developer called Quintain, who are developing all the land around Wembley Stadium. And you know, it is very much about that kind of playfulness, and there's a level of sort of intuition, hopefully, for people to interact with it.
Yeah.
And in this context, the Toronto piece is using, and I know there'll be questions around sort of technology, and I'm always asked the question of myself, what do things look like when they're off? Because people talk about this kind of use of screens as opposed to things that we build. In Toronto, we're using a Torontonian granite that's water jet cut, that has glass embedded in it. It has a tactility. In this context, it's a slotted steel surface. But I mean, we're in a tunnel that we get, on some days we get 20,000 soccer fans or football fans going through this environment. It's quite kind of heavily used, so it has a different quality to it. We're looking at things like the color temperature as well. You know, what kind of warmth does it bring to the space? But yeah, it's very much about that kind of playfulness.
Yeah. So there's a question picking up on that point from one of the attendees who says that there's something beautiful creatively, but could there be more use of organic materials to avoid the stark juxtaposition of nature and machine? How do you feel about that?
Well, sometimes we're working in, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you a project that is very, well, I think very organic. It's a commission by the Dubai Future Foundation, and we're looking at the future of, well, it's within the context of an exhibition that's about the future of wellness. Just scrolling through this. So this project, our main medium is water. So I suppose we are kind of traveling down a road where we're starting to explore mediums that are softer and I suppose more organic, or perhaps more sort of natural in some ways. And in this context, it's very much about looking at the qualities of water and how it makes us feel. And there's a lot of science, or certainly a lot of research going into why being in and around water is actually kind of very kind of good for you. And so this piece, yeah, was sat in a kind of environment that was all about the future of wellness, and this was really a speculation around how this kind of environment could make you feel, how it could be a reflective space, how it could be slightly meditative, how it could be, I think the word that was used by the curators of this entire space was self-transcendence, which, you know, I'm not even pretend to really know what that is. Yeah, this space, it was multi-sensorial, but it used water. And I suppose we are looking at these kind of ways of working closer with technology and closer to sort of natural mediums like water. We're working with plants as well. Obviously, there was a touch of that on that project with British Land, where we were like filming plants and working with them. And I'm thinking about that quite a lot at the moment, is how we can get closer to the kind of areas of our environment that we're green. However, we've got environments we're working with where plants are not allowed. So we're working in hospitals. We're working in environments where water is actually difficult as well. And it's interesting, there's quite a debate going on about abstractions of some of those things. Do they have the same effects on you? Which is kind of really interesting.
Yeah. And we have a comment which I think is worth sharing from one of the attendees, that who says that the shadow tunnel has mental well-being implications. It's phenomenal on so many levels. This is healing power. Think of the unseen, the homeless interacting with their shadows and seeing their significance and beauty reflected. And this attendee says this has deeply affected me. So, and it is really a delightful piece of work. We have a question from Rob Dennis, who says, excellent work, Jason. The Back to Front project, for example, is very engaging. How do you see AI affecting and influencing your work in the near and long term? Obviously, very topical issue that I'm sure you guys think about.
So that leads as a lovely segue. I mean, I can talk quite a bit about AI and what I think about it. I can also talk about it in terms of how we use it as a tool. But there's one project which we dove quite deeply into AI, and I'm going to pull that up. Give me 2 seconds. So yeah, so this was a commission from Google DeepMind. So it's their headquarters in London. And anyone that doesn't know DeepMind, it's a spin-off from University College London, which was in its very early days investigating artificial intelligence and using a lot of kind of gaming technology to sort of kind of test it. And some of you might have seen the film where one of the founders, Demis Hassabis, is developing a kind of system that plays games of Go against kind of world champions. I think it aired on Netflix. But anyway, moved forward a few years, they were acquired by Google, and they're doing a lot of work investigating and developing AI. And their new London headquarters, which is right in the middle of the Argent scheme at King's Cross, where they inhabit a few buildings, sort of separately to Google, but under the sort of Alphabet brand. There's an environment, and we were briefed. We were brought on by AHMM. We were introduced to Demis, the founder, and wanted to create a intervention, an artwork, an installation that talked to the research they're doing into AI. So this hanging piece you can see here, which is essentially in a voxel form, it's a sort of volumetric display, extruded through the space, is basically playing with different patterns that are generated by different forms of machine learning, neural networks, AI in its different forms. So it's a little bit of an experimental piece. There's not one mode. What was actually really interesting, regardless of where you sit in terms of AI research, was we collaborated with DeepMind on the code that actually drives this piece of work. So we did shared research, and we built an AI agent that actually runs this piece of work. So what it's doing, it has an emotional level. It gets bored, it gets exciting, and basically those emotions drive how it's choreographed. So in theory, we can set this thing running, and we will come back and not quite sure what it's doing, and it will change the kind of type of choreography, the type of animation, based on what it's seeing. There's a network of cameras that look at the space, and simply they've got like a heat map, and sort of very kind of low resolution. There's a lot of obviously conversations about picking up anonymous data from the space rather than in any way we can identify anyone, but learning from that and looking at the heat map, looking at, I suppose, the sort of space syntax in a very small scale of what's happening in that space, where do people move, how they're looking at it. And all of those things are affecting and changing how the artwork works. It's a sort of sculptural piece. It hangs. There is a brass substructure to the piece. All the power and data fall down through that brass substructure. And then each of these little kind of cubes within it are like little pixels, which fit onto that brass structure.
Yeah, I
So
mean, it's a magnificent piece, this, and really starts to address that very topical subject, obviously, about AI, and something that responds, I think, in a way that's not defensive, that it sort of seems to capture some of the uncertainties and ambiguities around AI, that we're uncertain of its power and its capacity, and this just like starts to explore that rather than kind of like trying to limit it. So it's really, really great.
and
We have a
within this one, you can see the kind of the view of the close up of us sort of building the sort of building blocks.
Oh yeah, okay, great. Yeah, a little kind of prototype. Obviously, prototyping is like a critical part of these sort of works, in which your intervention is novel, obviously very site specific, often at the limits of the capacity or capability of some technology. So we have a question from Javid Mohsin, who says, have you come across scenarios where your design has exceeded what technology is capable of delivering? And what do you do? Do you have to adapt, or do you abandon it? I guess as much as a question about like, how do you approach a design process, as it is about, you know, your specific interventions.
I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, most of the work, I mean, it starts very much obviously from an idea. It's contextual, it's site specific. There'll be a kind of story or an idea that's coming from an opportunity. And obviously we have a palette of materials and techniques we work with, but it is largely the idea and the story and the process that will then drive what technology we kind of use. And I could probably talk to a project. This was for this building. It's a headquarters for a tire manufacturer in the south of Seoul in South Korea. It's a Norman Foster building, and we were given this space to work with. So this was the kind of entrance kind of lobby going through this oculus into a 6 stories of atrium above and 2 below, and quite an extraordinary company. They make tires, but they also sort of work with driverless vehicles, robotics, all sorts of kind of weird and wonderful things. So yeah, the technology we were going to use and how we are going to work was sort of certainly up for grabs. And the kind of concept came from this idea of a sort of split level space, actually traveling through something. And where these ideas are going through these different, I mean, you could be like you were diving or snorkeling in the water. We settled on this sort of arboreal landscape, this kind of tree canopy, and the idea of traveling up to a tree. So very early on, there was a sort of question about how do you create a material which sort of gives this idea of, I think in Japanese it's called komorebi, light leaking through leaves. And it was like, you know, what materials can we use to create that kind of effect? So yeah, absolutely, you're right. Sometimes we'll be like, well, what can we use to do that? Because we're in a bright space. This has got to work day and night, and that's obviously a big question around using media in these types of installations. And sometimes it's not about the latest technology, it might be looking backwards. So in this context, we were looking at use of liquid crystal, which is actually a very, very old technology, and it's quite inert, but it's low power, but it gives you quite a lot of change in the attributes of something. So we do have to dig around for technologies. We look at sort of technology transfer, we look at old technologies, we look at new technologies. So in the context of this, we essentially developed and this is some sort of prototyping again, which is really important, looking at the combinations of materials that emit light and also block light. So in this context, you know, it was like, how can we do that? And we're talking about prototypes. So here was one of the first, well, actually, this is quite a developed prototype where we were building part of a idea of a sort of digital tree canopy. And I suppose the limitations here were we were starting to look at, we've got lots and lots of essentially metaphorical leaves in this project. So there was sort of like this many. And we were like thinking, well, how do they all sort of structurally work in that space? We've got 40 wires, we've got these leaves that clip on to create this sort of metaphor for this tree canopy. So immediately we're looking at kind of power and data structures. We're looking at kind of wirelessly controlling them, which we didn't do because there's a sort of latency with that in that kind of context. But then you get into kind of quite simple things, and you know, what's the actual install process and how does that work? So, you know, we're installing a piece across a 16-meter diameter oculus. It ended up being an open space. We got rid of the smoke screen by changing the fire strategy, and developed this piece of work that essentially, yeah, was this kind of living tree that responds to this environment around it, and it's taking data from weather apps to drive the sort of textures and the kind of wind blowing through the piece and how it animates and how it comes to life. But it can occlude light and it can also give out light simultaneously. And it also speeding it up through the seasons. It has a seasonality, it has a seasonal bias, which allows us to kind of really change the quality of the space over time.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is maybe partly practical, but it seems many of these projects that you've shown are sided within these sort of transition spaces,
Yes.
whether it's lobbies or circulation paths, or even in public realms. And I wonder if there's something, again, part of that may be practical, because often that's where clients are looking for something that either makes a statement or that sort of starts to create some dynamic element within what it might otherwise be quite perfunctory journey. But I wonder if there's something that you find attractive about those kind of liminal in-between spaces as well that helps sort of drive the work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, the kind of idea of liminal space is interesting, the in-between spaces. I mean, working at a larger scale, we're probably working at spaces in cities that perhaps don't get investment. So sometimes an intervention, an art commission can lift those spaces. Infrastructure projects are great because they've got these spaces where you've got captive audience, and it's all to do with the kind of perception of dwell time and how long something's taking potentially. So it actually, that can be quite valuable for a client.
Yeah.
Actually, so I'm talking about, yeah, so things like this. Platform 5 was a commission for a transport company in Sunderland, which was all about creating this kind of living painting, I suppose, that was activated by the trains going past it. So this living crowd, which appears to be waiting for the trains, inhabiting this sort of 145-meter long media artwork. This is driven by the trains, and it's about you know, driving this space, animating it, but keeping people captivated, creating an element of well-being or interest in that environment as you travel through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A follow-up question from Rob. He says, from a theoretical point of view, what were your influences as it relates to kinetic art and architecture?
Well, I think, and you picked up on it, I think quite rightly, one big influence is the sort of science and the kind of mathematics that underpin the natural world. So obviously there's a sort of lot of natural systems here. algorithms that kind of feed into the kind of inspiration. And I suppose with that, I mean, from a kind of research point of view, there are kind of other artistic practitioners which I've obviously inspired and been part of this journey. People that work with light, work with media. You know, we work alongside some quite extraordinary people. You know, looking at like something as simple as the sky and kind of meteorology, and you've got obviously amazing people like Terrell or Ned Khan, or I'm trying to think of someone else working with weather and clouds, for example. I mean, that's a big thing that I'm kind of really interested in at the moment. And because it all feeds into the environment and how it affects us. I mean, clouds are particularly powerful because they control our climate, and we're learning more and more about them every day. We're currently working on a piece at Tampa Airport at the moment, which is all about clouds and how they form and how they animate. And European Space Agency's just put up this amazing satellite that scans clouds and looks at how they form and where they form, called Earth Care. And it very much is that. So very much fascinated about the natural world and how we react to it. Within my sort of architectural training and research, obviously, I was sort of massively impacted by having, I had my professor at the Bartlett was Peter Cook. So things like archigram and, you know, the idea that buildings move and animate and perform was very much, you know, was a sort of precursor to my artistic practice, but, you know, very much led me into thinking about, you know, flexible, animated, performative spaces that might respond to you, that you might interact with, and, you know, early thinking around interaction design and so cybernetics, kind of human machine interfaces, all those sorts of things. Obviously robotics, we've obviously been working with and are working with kind of robotic systems, very kind of informative. And one of the things I always kind of suddenly realize is, you know, how did I end up in this world? And, you know, my mother trained as an artist and actually is an artist now, and my father was a software engineer. So it really is a sort of collision of those two worlds overlaid onto this sort of architectural canvas that kind of is the sort of main framework, I suppose, in which I'm working.
Yeah. You mentioned the challenges around the Constant Gardeners project, and I did want to touch on that just because I'm particularly just personally very taken with that. And it's very sort of obviously very culturally specific because of the Zen garden reference. But it also, for me, seems to explore the sort of very deliberate, gentle, controlled way in which the Japanese tend to work. And that there's this sort of transient quality, that great effort is applied to something that is sort of ephemeral and that disappears. And there's those famous monks that create these patterns in the sand, and then that deliberately evaporates, disappears, and which has this amazing impact on us as we think about our labor. And so I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the challenges of that project, and because there's a lot of hardware and very complex systems in a faraway place at a time when that was even more challenging than it usually is. So I wonder if there's maybe a little bit more you could tell us about the specific kind of challenges and how you stood up to those on that project.
Absolutely. I might talk about another project that relates to it as well, which was this project in Hull in Yorkshire, which actually was sort of a bit of a precursor. I mean, it was very much a bit of a test bed for the Constant Gardeners. And it was named by it was a UK City of Culture, which is, you know, all about kind of animating space, bringing cities to life, bringing slightly depressed and deprived cities back to life and getting investment into them. And they'd had a year of all sorts of amazing things going on, new art galleries, theatre, street performances, interventions of all types. And it was very much at the end of the year, what can you do to transform these spaces? And it was very much suggesting these series of sort of spatial media artworks that were performances, and the performers or actors were these upcycled industrial robots that would talk to the city and talk to each other. And there was a sort of theoretical framework very much about conversation and very much about how things talk to each other. And it's a maritime city, so there's quite a lot of work and research in terms of things talking to each other over long distances, like out at sea and that kind of thing. So it's all looking at sort of telecommunication and the optics and all the kind of challenges around that. So these robots will talk to each other, but the first thing you do when you bring one of these sort of industrial robots out of the factory into a public space, you've suddenly got lots and lots of challenges that are around these very big machines that are not designed to be in the public realm near people. And it was quite an extraordinary really journey, and which was played out again in Tokyo, really, which was, how do you sort of prototype, design, develop and build something like this where there are no rules around? So like the North American systems, well, like the UK system of doing planning and kind of drawing things and submitting it to local authorities, submitting it to sort of heritage authorities. It was like, because it was there long enough, it had the same criteria as building anything else. And I was like, how do I do a drawing where the thing moves the entire time? There's no one static section and there's no one static plan. And even from the engineering point of view, the inertia, the movement, the mass, everything, many bits of it changing in terms of the effect on people, etc., etc. So it was really interesting starting to navigate a space, which we sometimes do without any codes or without any ones that are kind of normal in terms of, structural analysis, or, how does this sit against the sort of medieval architecture of Hull, or, how's it explored? What's the visitor flow through it? So it was, it was kind of interesting, and that kind of carried on also in Tokyo as well. And you can sort of see again, it was really about how to create these performances that aren't going to overwhelm, but at the same time are going to be safe. So there's a lot of kind of building these systems that keep the public safe whilst you're kind of creating these robotic performances. And going into Tokyo, we had 3 safety systems that allowed us to sort of run these robotic performances in and around, like we had hundreds of thousands of people come through, even though it's a pandemic situation, and visit the piece and kind of, and we had to keep them safe, obviously. And actually, if we look at that in context, yeah, we had there was a sort of software that so the robots had an idea about where they were, but they're quite old robots, so they don't have super clever systems in terms of proprioception, which is like where each piece is. They only know that because they've reset themselves once, and they know where the history of all their movements, and therefore they know where they are. There's some yellow posts which have basically laser is being emitted across through these yellow posts. If anyone breaks those beams, they stop. We also had invigilators that would stop the piece as well. So just layers and layers of really kind of mundane things, but without that, there was sort of comprehension that it wouldn't possibly not be safe to run. But now this is leading into work where we are working on robotic landscapes currently, which are permanent and a much larger scale. And so it's kind of interesting that some of these decisions, and some of them they're ethical, some of them are to do with how do the machines talk to you? How do you know what they're going to do? If they're creating an environment for you that you're walking through or being part of, how do you know what they're doing? And you get into that whole debate around things like driverless cars. How do they communicate with you? How do you know what they're doing if you can't look a driver in the eye? But it's the same thing if you've got a transformative landscape with essentially vehicles or things that are autonomously moving around in it, how do you know what they're going to do? And I know there's plenty of cities around the world where people are starting to explore with autonomous delivery vehicles, robots and other things, and it starts to develop quite an interesting landscape where some things move and they're moving on their own autonomously or under some kind of control, and that is quite interesting. It's a sort of interesting design challenge.
Yeah, and in the same way as in this particular piece that there is a reconfiguring of a landscape going on, that in the same way these technologies themselves are reconfiguring at a larger scale. And the piece you did at the university in which you were exploring those large scale industrial processes of agriculture, I think are the same sort of large scale, almost planet wide reconfiguring of a whole environment. So it really seems to kind of like have a dialogue with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, and there was things, I mean, the challenges here really, I mean, working in a pandemic when you don't have an ability to test things for long enough, everything's accelerated, decisions are last minute. I mean, even worse so than normal. So one of the things we had to do here, we had to build this entire rig in the UK before we shipped it. And in the ideal world, we were like, Japanese contractors are extraordinary. We would love to work with them. Japanese robotics companies are even more extraordinary. We would love to work with them, but that was all off the table as soon as it was locked down, and so we actually had to we built a complete rig actually in Yorkshire and Wakefield inside a massive shed that's usually used for sort of prototyping stages for pop concerts. But in this case, we're testing the entire installation before it's shipped. And very much down to even the language of the end effectors, how the gravel's moved, how the gravel's cleaned. We even got into the size of the aggregate, the color of the aggregate, what would happen with typhoons, is it going to get blown around, how the robots protected, IP rating or UL ratings of robots, etc., etc. So there was sort of many things that we just had to drill down into.
Yeah, it's a really extraordinary achievement to realize something like this, and really a wonderful, delightful piece. We have another question for Rob, which is: says, any advice to public sector clients or owners as to how to really engage with your team as artists to get the most out of these commissions? There are typically tight budgets, tight sites, areas, etc. Do you prefer constraints and restrictions or unfettered freedom?
Well, there's a couple of good questions there. I mean, being engaged at a point earlier on in the process, I mean, sometimes can seem like there's too many opportunities and things might change, but I think it gives us opportunities to get involved with the project at a level where we can affect many things, but also take advantage of things. So, if a facade's being designed, there's an opportunity to tweak something a little bit, because people get hung up obviously on the cost and the budget. But if there's a small change to something, you can obviously do some quite extraordinary things. With the budget becomes a little bit of an uplift rather than a sort of massive thing you've got to add on at the end. So I would encourage commissioners and people organizing projects to think perhaps more on the early side, even if there's a risk of things perhaps changing or there being things that might change the kind of line of a project. I'm just thinking through what other things have been really helpful. It's also good to have someone that's actually quite engaged with what you're doing. I've had projects where there's been very little engagement, getting information, getting feedback, getting buy-in, finding other partners and ways of bringing a project along. I mean, if you can get partners involved that might be involved with the investment, might be involved with, kind of really bringing a project to life and elevating it. Having a commissioner that's kind of really engaged and on board with a project is kind of really good. Complete freedom sometimes. I think I'm very used to working in the context of the built environment and with canvases that exist, or where there are parameters or things that you kind of spring off in terms of ideas. So sometimes I must admit, given a complete, very, very rarely work in the gallery or in a sort of white box or a black box. So I do sometimes get a bit paralyzed with the amount of opportunity. But I mean, we are building work quite often that's going to last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So building something in a white or black box that's perhaps more ephemeral and temporary is also very exciting. So yeah, happy to look at things either end of the scale.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about the studio because you've you seem to have like a range of disciplines working with you. Obviously, other artists, designers, makers, fabricators, coders, and I can imagine a broad spectrum. And it's unusual that you have all of that in house. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the studio. So I wonder how that. I can't imagine that evolved quickly or easily or naturally. And there's a sort of strange alchemy that you seem to have with your team. How did you manage to assemble that group and kind of how do you manage its growth as projects come in and as the studio gets bigger?
I mean, some of that has been organic, but certainly, I mean, I sort of built a team around me of people that perhaps been on a similar journey, trained as architects, but like working on the fringes of architecture, working with installations, performance, exhibitions. So people that would have the skills to kind of decode projects, think of ideas, present them in different ways. But then I think one thing that became sort of quite abundantly clear quite early on was the design for manufacture element of that, and the sort of idea of almost creating products meant that I started having to sort of hire industrial designers slash design engineers. I realizing that detailing everything as if it's a building is not necessarily going to work, and we might need a sort of just a wider set of skills and thinking around design for manufacture. This is more specialist, and people have had different journeys into that than through architecture. So then furniture makers, product designers, 3D designers, design engineers were definitely part of the kind of cohort that we were looking to. So I was sort of hiring, industrial designers coming out of Northumbria University in the UK, which was has a very strong kind of alumni, people like John Fanive, people like that coming out of that. So people looking at product and and but then at the same time, we have to describe and communicate what we're doing. So the ability to, I'm just sort of thinking if I've got, I can show off the top of my head here, but the ability to, actually, yes, I can. The ability to visualize what we're doing has evolved as well. So now, not only are we visualizing what we do, we're creating digital twins of the things we make. So this is the tree and soul, and this is it in a games engine. So again, where are you finding games designers that understand this sort of environment, or are they architects or someone like that that have kind of gone into a slightly different realm? So people working in computational design, gaming, those sorts of environments are becoming quite useful because we're creating, because our artworks use algorithms and are quite animated and come to life. Using this technology allows us to do lots and lots of things, and this artwork is actually controlled by a games engine. So it's running a Unity project, which runs the project in Soul via a media server, and it allows us to prototype as well. So yeah, as we've developed, I'm sort of developing skills, and where the gaps are is quite interesting. I mean, we don't have a composer or sound designer on the team, and we collaborate externally there. All the robotics work was done in-house, but we sometimes talk to people that are even more specialist. One of the things that's cropping up around projects like the working with the plants, I'm sort of contemplating horticulturalists. We don't need writers actually, really. So, sort of, people that are kind of perhaps professional writers per se, but there's a bit of writing and thinking about projects and how they're communicated is kind of something. So there are skill sets where I can sort of see opportunities within the team.
We've closed in on the hour, and it's kind of it's been a terrific conversation. I put your link to your website and to RIBA-USA's events in the chat for everyone to see. I did want to ask, just as we wrap up, kind of what's next for the studio, what's on the horizon, are there kinds of things that you would like to do that you haven't done that you'd like to do more of? Kind of what does the future look like for the studio?
I mean, I talked about we've got a couple of projects in North America currently where we're working on a cancer center in New Jersey. We're working on the National Library of Canada. We've got some great infrastructure work. I mean, what we're really enjoying is projects where there's really opportunities for collaboration. I think across technology, life sciences, there's some amazing opportunities. I mean, I'd love to do, as I sort of probably alluded to, more work in the botanical realm, looking at kind of natural environments in and around big projects. So I think that's going to be quite a big area. But yeah, really, really interested in sort of clients that want to invest in their environments culturally, and that probably there's a sweet spot in terms of having a sort of technological or scientific interest as well.
Yeah. Well, we're going to distribute this widely, and I hope the audience tells everyone they know about your work, because I think it should be everywhere. And there's such delight in especially some of these kind of neglected spaces in intervening in the way that you have. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to talk to us. It's been really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. And yeah, next visit, we're going to be in Miami in 2 weeks. So if anyone knows of anything exciting to do there, please do tell us.
Do get in touch with Jason and his team,
yeah.
or with me, and we hope we can catch up again soon. Thanks again.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a delight to be part of this conversation.
Okay, and thanks to the whole audience. Bye now.